The geographical and ecological contours of the archipelago that would eventually become New York City were shaped during the last glacial period, establishing an estuarine environment of unparalleled biological density. Long before European contact, this territory was inhabited by the Lenape, an Algonquian-speaking nomadic people whose societal organization was intricately bound to the cyclical rhythms of the local ecology. The Lenape were divided into distinct bands, such as the Minsi in the northern reaches and the Unami in the central river valleys, who utilized the Hudson River, which they named Shattamuck, as a vital artery for both sustenance and intertribal commerce. For the inhabitants of Mannahatta, the mixing of salt water from the Atlantic with the fresh water of the Hudson created a rich habitat supporting vast quantities of fish and shellfish, forming the foundation of a sophisticated subsistence economy. The Lenape economic model was predicated on an acute awareness of resource sustainability. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture to cultivate crops, extending the productive life of the soil, but heavy tillage inevitably led to nutrient depletion. Consequently, the Lenape operated on a roughly two-decade cycle of transhumance, routinely abandoning exhausted village sites to allow the land to regenerate while establishing new semi-permanent settlements of dome-shaped bark wigwams along adjacent riverbanks. By the early 16th century, approximately 15,000 Lenape inhabited the wider metropolitan region across roughly 80 settlement sites, existing in a balanced equilibrium with the land. The trajectory of this indigenous landscape was permanently altered by the arrival of European mercantilist interests. Following initial exploration, the Dutch Republic chartered the Dutch West India Company in 1621, granting it a monopoly over trade in the Americas and West Africa. The subsequent establishment of New Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan in 1624 must be understood not as a traditional colonial settlement driven by ideological or religious imperatives, but as a profit-driven corporate outpost designed to protect the company's lucrative fur trading operations further up the Hudson River. The economic policies of the Dutch West India Company had catastrophic second-order effects on the Lenape. The Dutch recognized the indigenous reliance on wampum as a medium of exchange and actively sought to dominate this system. By trading mass-produced European metal tools to the Lenape, the Dutch inadvertently triggered the hyperproduction of wampum, effectively debasing the indigenous currency. Forced into an economic paradigm dictated by European capital, Lenape men abandoned traditional subsistence hunting and fishing in favor of intensive beaver trapping to secure trade goods. This ecological overexploitation led to the near-total eradication of the beaver population across the 5 boroughs within 2 decades, rendering the Lenape economically dependent on the corporate colony and precipitating a severe population decline, exacerbated by introduced European diseases. Simultaneously, the physical infrastructure of New Amsterdam reflected its corporate and defensive priorities. Under the authoritarian governance of Director General Peter Stuyvesant, appointed in 1647, the settlement was transformed from a bedraggled outpost into a structured commercial hub. To protect the Dutch West India Company's assets from British and Native American incursions, Stuyvesant ordered the construction of a 12-foot wooden stockade wall across the northern boundary of the settlement in 1653, the structural progenitor of Wall Street. This fortification, alongside Fort Amsterdam and a network of canals, such as the Broad Canal built to facilitate maritime trade directly into the settlement, was constructed utilizing the labor of white indentured servants and enslaved Africans. Stuyvesant's mandate was to ensure profitability above all else, resulting in a dictatorial regime that prioritized corporate returns over the welfare of the highly diverse, polyglot population that had migrated to the port, laying the initial groundwork for the city's complex political culture. The surrender of New Amsterdam to the English in 1664 marked a fundamental shift in the political economy of the city. Under British imperial rule, the renamed city of New York was integrated into a vast transatlantic mercantilist system. The island's deep-water port, naturally sheltered and ice-free, became the vital geographical linchpin for the triangular trade. New York transitioned from a localized fur trading post into the primary logistical and financial hub for the provisioning of Caribbean sugar plantations and the export of southern agricultural commodities. Crucially, the economic expansion of British New York was inextricably linked to the transatlantic slave trade and the exploitation of enslaved labor. The city itself was a major slaveholding center. By the mid-18th century, approximately 20% of the population was enslaved, and nearly half of all Manhattan households utilized forced labor. In 1711, the city's Common Council formalized the commodification of human beings by establishing a municipal slave market at the corner of Wall Street and Pearl Street. Operating until 1762, this open-air market allowed city officials to generate tax revenue directly from the buying, selling, and renting of enslaved Africans and indigenous people. The physical proximity of this market to the waterfront allowed enslaved individuals to be transported directly from ships docked on the East River, serving as the foundational labor force that built municipal infrastructure, worked the docks, and sustained the city's agricultural hinterland. The strategic importance of New York's maritime infrastructure made it the focal point of military occupation during the American Revolution. The British maintained control of the city throughout the conflict, utilizing the port as a naval base and a refuge for loyalists. Following the war, the city faced immense physical and economic devastation, and the recovery of the newly independent nation required sophisticated financial engineering, spearheaded by Alexander Hamilton, the first United States Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton's fiscal policies, which included the federal assumption of Revolutionary War debt and the creation of a central bank, necessitated the creation of liquid secondary markets where debt instruments and bank stocks could be traded. The components of 1790 effectively cemented Wall Street as the financial capital of the burgeoning republic.
However, the early, unregulated trading of securities led to rampant speculation and the financial panic of 1792. In response, 24 stockbrokers gathered under a buttonwood tree outside 68 Wall Street on May 17, 1792, to sign the Buttonwood Agreement. This foundational document established a formal, centralized system for trading securities with standardized commissions and dispute resolution mechanisms, representing the birth of the New York Stock Exchange. Yet the early financial architecture of Wall Street remained deeply entangled with the economics of human bondage. The securities traded on the nascent exchange, including shares in the Bank of New York, facilitated loans that were heavily collateralized by enslaved people. As the 19th century dawned and cotton emerged as the dominant global commodity, New York's financial institutions underwrote the expansion of southern plantations, building modern capitalist institutions fueled directly by the commodification of human life. As New York entered the 19th century, civic leaders recognized that the city's haphazard medieval street pattern was fundamentally incompatible with the demands of rapid commercial expansion. The response was the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, an audacious infrastructural mandate that superimposed a rigid rectilinear grid over the varied topography of Manhattan. While historically celebrated as a triumph of rational urban planning, the grid was intrinsically an economic mechanism designed to facilitate real estate speculation. By standardizing lot sizes and ignoring natural geographic barriers, the grid transformed raw land into highly liquid, easily quantifiable commodities that could be bought, sold, and developed with unprecedented speed by capitalist speculators. If the grid structured the internal capital of the city, the Erie Canal radically altered its external macroeconomic position. Prior to the canal's completion in 1825, the Appalachian Mountains presented a formidable barrier to inland trade, making the transport of bulk goods prohibitively expensive. The construction of the Erie Canal, a monumental feat of civil engineering connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, effectively bypassed this barrier. The economic implications were staggering. It reduced the cost of shipping goods between the Midwest and the Atlantic by approximately 95% and slashed transit times by weeks. This structural advantage granted New York City an absolute monopoly over interior trade, ensuring that the vast agricultural wealth of the expanding American frontier was channeled directly through its port. Within a decade, the massive volume of canal tolls completely amortized the project's construction debt, and New York permanently displaced its rivals to become the undisputed commercial capital of the United States. This macroeconomic explosion triggered exponential demographic growth, with the city's population swelling from 124,000 to nearly 200,000 between 1820 and 1830, driven largely by surges in foreign immigration. The unprecedented density resulting from this influx created severe public health crises, notably cholera epidemics exacerbated by a lack of potable water and sanitation. The city's response, the construction of the Croton Aqueduct, represented a massive public investment in health infrastructure, further enabling the city to absorb millions of subsequent immigrants. The management of this soaring, highly concentrated immigrant population fell not to formal city administrators, but to the pervasive influence of political machines, most notably Tammany Hall. Operating outside the strictures of formal government, Tammany Hall functioned as a parallel welfare state and a ruthless power syndicate. Under leaders like William Boss Tweed, the machine traded basic constituent services for unwavering political loyalty and votes. The machine recognized that control of the immigrant labor force was the key to dominating the city's lucrative public works contracts. Tammany systematically funneled immigrant labor into the construction of defining civic infrastructure, including sewer systems, public parks like Central Park, and monumental projects like the Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883 under the oversight of a Tammany-controlled company. While characterized by spectacular graft, this system of machine politics effectively mobilized an alienated underclass and physically built the infrastructure required for the city's industrial maturation. By the close of the 19th century, the functional economy of the New York harbor had vastly outgrown its fragmented political jurisdictions. The movement to consolidate Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and parts of Queens and the Bronx into a single municipal entity was driven by intense economic imperatives and fierce political calculations. Civic reformers, spearheaded by Andrew Haswell Green, argued that a unified port administration was essential to maintain the region's global commercial supremacy against rising competitors. However, consolidation faced bitter opposition, particularly from Brooklyn nativists, who feared that a merger would subject their independent city to the corrupt influence of Manhattan's Tammany Hall and burden them with the financial liabilities of Manhattan's massive public works projects. The stalemate was ultimately broken by the machinations of Thomas C. Platt, the formidable leader of the New York State Republican Party. Platt viewed consolidation through the lens of political hegemony. He calculated that the integration of the largely Republican outer boroughs could successfully dilute the immense electoral power of the Manhattan Democratic machine, allowing state Republicans to control the vast patronage and tax revenues of the newly formed greater city. Through sheer legislative muscle, Platt engineered the passage of the Consolidation Charter, and the city of Greater New York officially came into existence on January 1, 1998. With the political boundaries established, the early 20th century witnessed an unprecedented infrastructure boom designed to knit the disparate boroughs together. The construction of massive suspension bridges, including the Williamsburg and Manhattan bridges, and the rapid excavation of the subterranean subway network radically altered the city's demographic distribution. These transit arteries functioned as pressure valves for the hyper-congested slums of Lower Manhattan, facilitating a massive decentralization of the working-class population outward into newly developed residential and industrial hubs in the outer boroughs. Concurrently, the architectural profile of Manhattan was soaring vertically. The convergence of structural steel, elevator technology, and high land values birthed the skyscraper, symbolized by early monoliths like the Singer Building. However, unregulated vertical expansion threatened to plunge the city's narrow streets into perpetual darkness, prompting a major political intervention in the form of the 1916 zoning resolution. This landmark legislation mandated structural setbacks to preserve light and air, fundamentally dictating the iconic skyline architecture of the city. Throughout the World Wars, this consolidated, hyper-connected, and vertically integrated metropolis operated as the undisputed economic engine of the Allied war efforts, processing staggering volumes of military materiel and underwriting international debt, leaving the city at the apex of its manufacturing power by 1945. The post-war era, however, was defined by an aggressive paradigm of top-down urban renewal orchestrated largely by Robert Moses. Operating outside the bounds of traditional democratic accountability, Moses consolidated unprecedented power through his mastery of semi-autonomous public authorities, most notably the Tri-Borough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. By capturing the immense toll revenues generated by the city's bridges and tunnels, Moses secured an independent financial base that allowed him to issue municipal bonds to fund massive public works with little outside oversight. Moses explicitly drafted these bond contracts into state law to render them inviolable, preventing democratically elected officials, such as Mayor John Lindsay, from appropriating surplus revenues to rescue the city's deteriorating subway system. Shielded from political interference, Moses implemented an automobile-centric vision for the city, prioritizing the construction of expressways and massive slum clearance projects over public transit infrastructure. This approach physically fractured established neighborhoods, displaced hundreds of thousands of low-income residents, and fundamentally reshaped the demographic reality of the metropolitan region to favor the suburban commuter. Simultaneously, the foundational pillars of the city's economy were quietly collapsing. The maritime economy, the historical bedrock of New York's wealth, was revolutionized by the advent of shipping containerization. The narrow, congested finger piers of Manhattan and Brooklyn were entirely unsuited for the massive acreage required for container logistics. Consequently, the port economy migrated across the harbor to Port Newark and Elizabeth in New Jersey, taking tens of thousands of lucrative blue-collar jobs with it. This macroeconomic hollowing out triggered a devastating cycle of capital flight. As manufacturing and maritime employment vanished, the city experienced a massive exodus of the white middle class to the suburbs, facilitated by the highway infrastructure Moses had championed. The loss of this tax base pushed the city's finances to the breaking point, climaxing in the 1970s fiscal crisis. Unable to service its mounting short-term debt and facing the breakdown of municipal services, New York was ultimately forced to cede fiscal sovereignty to state-appointed oversight boards in exchange for emergency federal bailout loans, marking the nadir of the city's 20th century history.
The salvation of New York City's economy in the late 1970s and 1980s was achieved through a brutal pivot away from industrial labor and toward a hyper-financialized, service and technology-based paradigm. Deregulation ignited a massive boom on Wall Street, transforming the city into a global command center for international capital. However, this economic rebirth was highly stratified, generating immense wealth for the corporate sector while leaving peripheral neighborhoods grappling with the devastating impacts of the crack cocaine epidemic and record levels of violent crime. The political response materialized in the 1990s under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and Police Commissioner William Bratton through the implementation of broken windows policing. Rooted in the theory that visible signs of low-level disorder created an environment encouraging serious violent crime, the police department enacted a zero-tolerance policy, aggressively pursuing misdemeanor arrests and widely utilizing stop-and-frisk tactics. While the 1990s witnessed a dramatic decline in major felonies, the causal attribution to this specific strategy remains highly contested, with economists pointing to broader macroeconomic improvements and demographic shifts. The policy exacted a profound social toll, disproportionately targeting minority communities, criminalizing low-income residents, inflating the carceral system, and severely fracturing public trust in law enforcement, creating deep civic divisions that persist today. The transition into the 21st century under Mayor Michael Bloomberg saw these policing strategies coupled with an aggressive restructuring of the city's real estate economics. Operating under the economic assumption that increasing housing supply would alleviate price pressures, the Bloomberg administration executed neighborhood-scale rezonings, covering nearly 40% of the city's landmass between 2002 and 2013. This rezoning actively catalyzed luxury development in formerly industrial and working-class neighborhoods. The 2005 rezoning of the Williamsburg and Greenpoint waterfronts is illustrative. Despite warnings from urbanists like Jane Jacobs that the plan would enrich developers at the cost of the community, the influx of affluent residents triggered massive rent hikes. Rents in Williamsburg spiked by 69%, corresponding with a severe decline in the local minority population and widespread gentrification. The primary mechanism fueling this development was the 421A tax exemption, which granted developers property tax exemptions for up to 35 years in exchange for setting aside a percentage of units as affordable housing under programs like mandatory inclusionary housing. However, the program costs the city roughly $1.77 billion annually in foregone tax revenue, and a significant portion of the generated units are targeted at households earning over $100,000 a year, rendering them entirely inaccessible to the low-income residents actively being displaced. These socioeconomic tensions were temporarily overshadowed by the catastrophic events of September 11, 2001, which brutally exposed the vulnerabilities of the modern city. The destruction of the World Trade Center resulted in a staggering economic toll, causing an estimated $33 billion to $36 billion in total losses. This included $16.4 billion in property damage, as over 31 million square feet of prime commercial real estate was obliterated or severely damaged, alongside roughly $7.8 billion in lost lifetime earnings for the deceased workers. Despite initial speculation of a mass corporate exodus, the financial sector proved highly resilient. Unprecedented liquidity injections by the Federal Reserve stabilized the macroeconomy, and nearly 80% of the displaced commercial tenants ultimately relocated within Manhattan, allowing the city to rebuild and reaffirm its institutional gravity.
Yet, as the city advanced into the modern era, it confronted an existential threat far less localized than terrorism: global climate change. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy laid bare the extreme vulnerability of a coastal megacity, inundating the financial district, crippling transit grids, causing an estimated $19 billion in damages, and disproportionately devastating low-income public housing residents. The macroeconomic risk is escalating rapidly. The market value of real estate in the city's 100-year floodplain currently sits at roughly $176 billion, but is projected to rise to $242 billion by the 2050s, threatening billions in annual tax revenue and placing 17% of the public housing portfolio in direct jeopardy. In response, the city initiated massive infrastructural countermeasures like the Big U, an ambitious 10-mile protective perimeter conceptualized by the Bjarke Ingels Group, designed to integrate deployable floodwalls and bridging berms into the urban landscape. However, the execution of the Big U and projects like the East Side Coastal Resiliency Initiative highlight the systemic lethargy of contemporary municipal governance. Decades after Sandy, progress remains stalled by bureaucratic fragmentation, complex procurement protocols, and community opposition. Ultimately, the modern megacity remains defined by the infrastructural decisions of its past, relying heavily upon its historical capacity for aggressive reinvention to harmonize the relentless pursuit of real estate profitability with the existential necessity of equitable climate resilience.